Great stuff. I'll just give it a second because I know it can take a minute for everyone to kind of pile in. So good morning, everyone, as you're joining. A very good wet and rainy May morning to everybody. Great stuff. So I can see the participants list is growing there. So good morning, everyone. I hope you're all having a good day. You're very welcome to this morning's webinar, Tips and Tricks for Grant Writing, with our very own Emma Murtagh. So my name is Sinead. I'll just run through some very quick housekeeping and then I will hand over to the star of the show, Emma. So you'll notice that you've come into a Zoom webinar, which is slightly different to a Zoom meeting, which you might be a bit more accustomed to past however many months. So just to let you know that you are all as attendees muted and your cameras are off, and you'll notice that you don't have the option anywhere on your screen to turn those on or off again. So you don't have to worry about that. You can sit back, relax, you can take some notes. And if you need to ask any questions for Emma, you can pop those into the Q&A box, which will be down the bottom of your screen. If you jiggle your mouse around, you should see it pop down the bottom of your screen. So questions for Emma can go into there, and she's got some time at the end of the session where she can get to those, and I can keep an eye on them as well in case there's anything that's not clear throughout. I might just butt in, Emma, if there is anything that needs clarification. If you're having any issues just in terms of your technology, if Zoom is acting up on you or something's not clear, you can pop that into the chat to me. It'll go to the panelists, so that it'll just be myself and Emma who can see that. And I can try my best to give you a hand there, but just try and keep the questions on the topic for Emma in the Q&A. It just makes it a bit easier then when we're trying to answer those at the end. And I am recording today's webinar, so if anything terrible happens and you get booted out, don't worry, you'll get a copy of the recording. But likewise, if you get booted out, you can just come back in again by that same link. So I'll be sharing that recording and the slides afterwards with everyone who's here. So that is me for now. I shall hand over now to Emma.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So I think everyone can see them there. And just to say hi to everyone, and you are very welcome to this webinar on grant writing tips and tricks. This is part of a series of free webinars on a variety of topics that we run on Friday mornings exclusively for members of the Wheel. So just to introduce myself, my name is Emma Murtagh and I'm the European Programmes Manager here at the Wheel. My background is primarily in writing and managing EU funded grants, but I've worked on a variety of funding applications and tenders. And before taking on the role of European Programmes Manager, I held different grant writing roles, including Grants Research Officer for the Wheel. So just some general kind of housekeeping before we get stuck in. As Sinead said, this session is being recorded, so you will receive that recording along with the slides and any other kind of resources and templates that I referenced throughout today's session. So you don't need to go too mad taking down notes. You'll get everything in the follow-up later. As Sinead also said, I won't really be able to see the Q&A box as I'm presenting, but do feel free to kind of post questions in there anyway. And we should have at least 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. And then if there's any kind of chat, or if you need to get in touch with Sinead and ask a technical question, you can use the chat box. Another little kind of caveat that I always push at the top of this training is what I'm presenting here in terms of grant writing is kind of a general model. You know, obviously grant writing is very varied. It can be everything from, you know, a couple of €1,000 from your local council, right up to potentially hundreds of thousands, even millions of euro from big funders like the EU. So what I've tried to do here is just kind of a general one-size-fits-all approach, but it isn't in any way an exact science. There is no one way of doing grants. So do feel free as we're going along to kind of share any of your own tips and tricks that you've come up with over the years in terms of grant writing, and put them into the chat box. And at the end, we can kind of have a look at that and try and compile our collective knowledge. So anything that I might not touch on today, do feel free to kind of share in the chat box. And I suppose on that note, I did want to kind of have a look at what kind of experience we have in the room here. So I think Sinead, let me know if I need to stop sharing my screen, but I think Sinead can put up a poll on the screen there to look at, how would you rate your own grant writing experience? So it can go from none to some experience, to substantial experience. And I think everybody should have that in front of them now, and they should be able to vote. And we can have a look at, where people are in their grant writing experience. So I can see the poll, Sinead, but I don't know if I'm not seeing any results yet. So maybe it just takes another minute.
Yeah, so it's currently we've got 33% of people have voted. So I'll just leave it for a little bit longer, just in case anyone's getting to it. And then I can share the results with everybody.
Perfect, great. So it's just an idea of where everybody is. And as I said, I won't get to cover everything in today's. It is only 1 hour. So, if there's anything that maybe I've forgotten about or overlooked, please do share it, and we can pool our collective knowledge in the chat box. Can we share the results now, Sinead? There we go. So we have, there's a nice mixture. I don't know if everybody can see the results there, but we have around 20% with no experience. We have around 63% with some experience, and we have about 15% with substantial experience. So that's a nice kind of mixture in the room. And I'm sure that there will be some different tips and tricks that I might not touch on today that we can kind of share amongst ourselves. So that's great. Thank you very much for that, Sinead, my lovely assistant. So just looking then at what are we going to cover today. So there's just generally 5 points that we will cover. The first one is preparing for success. So these are kind of different things that you can do right now to help set up your organization for success in grants. It's often called grant readiness. So we'll have a look at those. Then we're going to look at analyzing grant opportunities. And there's kind of a simple tool that I've developed that will hopefully help with that. And I'm just going to share it with you. We look at the project development process. So this is just a step-by-step process for, if you've identified an opportunity and you've decided to go for it, how to kind of go about organizing a system to get a grant in and done well within the time frame. Then there's the rules. So these are just general rules that I've kind of come up with over the years in no particular order that I try to follow every time that I write a project. And then there's the results as well, because I suppose it's not just about getting the application in, it's also what to do when you hear about the results. So we'll just touch on that briefly. So the first thing that we're going to look at, as I said, is preparing for success. So these are things you can do right now to make sure that your organization is kind of ready to act quickly when the right opportunity comes along. As I said, this is sometimes called being grant ready, and it's about compiling relevant information and documentation ahead of time. And as we go through it, I've got a few points that I'll share here. It might seem like all of these things are very simple and straightforward and would be very quick to kind of pull together. And they are, they absolutely are. But it's not something you want to be doing kind of coming up to a deadline. With grants, obviously, it's all about deadlines, and anything you can do to try and, pull together this simple, straightforward information, have it together in one kind of clear, organized space can save a lot of hassle and stress coming up to a very tight deadline. So for me anyway, I just house all of this information together in a folder in the Wheels shared drive, which I call like a copy bank, because it's full of copy for applications. But you can come up with your own system of where to store all of this information. But it is a key step that you can take now to start kind of compiling all of this. So the very first thing, and very simply, is long and short descriptions of your organization. Again, this might seem really simple and that this would be easy, and it is easy, but it's often the very first question that's asked of you in an application is to describe your organization. So it's your opportunity to kind of make a first impression. Sometimes they give you 50 words, sometimes they give you 500 words. So having those kind of long and short versions ready can be really helpful. And it's worth kind of taking some time to really write this properly, to kind of present your organization in the best possible light, to edit it well, to focus on who you are, what you do, the impact that you have, your vision, your mission, things like that, and have it nicely kind of tied together in a well-written, well-edited kind of piece that you can then copy and paste and adapt for various applications. And as I said, it's the first thing that they'll often read. And sometimes people are so focused on the project that they think they kind of leave this stuff as almost an afterthought and just copy and paste it in at the end from a website or from an old application or something. But it is your opportunity to make a first impression. So it's worth taking some time to do that properly. The next thing then is past projects. And, for some of you might have multiple past projects. Some of you might not have any. If that's the case, you can write about various kind of programs or operational work that you have for sure. But if you have got some examples of really good past projects that you've run, it can be worth just having a paragraph prepared for them, because if you do need to talk about it in an application, whether you're asked specifically about past projects or whether you want to use it as an example in an answer about project management and about your impact, it can be really handy to have that together in one condensed paragraph. What was it? Who funded it? What impact did it have? What results did it have? And then any links or anything like that to those projects that could be useful to put into applications. Because otherwise you can find yourself coming up to a deadline, sifting through old applications and trying to find final reports and editing down information, and it can get very sloppy. So it's nice to have a paragraph or two on each of at least your most successful projects ready to go, ready to kind of copy and paste into applications as examples of success. The next thing then is, I suppose this is kind of touching on what you have to offer a funder. So, you can kind of roughly summarize this as your reach, your capacity, and your resources. So your reach is, and this is the thing that you have that can add value to the funder's grant. So, they're going to invest in you, but what do you have that will add value to the project? So for example, your reach, if you're a big national organization like the Wheel, it can be all about numbers and reaching into every county and having X amount of people follow you and receive your updates or follow your social media or whatever it is. So it can be all about those big numbers, but it doesn't have to be. If you have very impressive numbers, absolutely brilliant. Have those together up to date in a document so that you can easily, kind of open that document and pull out, okay, how many subscribers do we have to that newsletter? How many people use our services every year? And you have those numbers available to you, and you're not kind of sifting through trying to find them. And so if you have big, huge numbers, that's great, but don't worry if you don't, because your reach can also be about the quality of the reach that you have. So it doesn't have to be hugely impressive numbers. It can be about having a unique kind of connection to your specific community and where you're uniquely placed to reach out to those people, and you're trusted and you're of that community. So, it doesn't have to be about numbers. It can be about the quality of the relationship that you have with a specific target group that this funder is interested in reaching. The next thing is your capacity. So these are, whether it's your staff, whether it's your volunteers, what you have to offer that would add value to a project. So kind of have a good idea of, maybe you have a really excellent volunteer team, maybe you have really good kind of comms or marketing team, or you're really good at outreach and awareness, like whatever it is, have some good idea of what it is you do well and what kind of capacity you have that can add to an application. And having a little bit of copy prepared for that can help to make it easier to describe that in an application, especially when you're coming up to a deadline. The next thing is resources. So this wouldn't really apply to us at the Wheel, but for example, if you were a community, like a community hub or a community center, it might be your actual physical space that you have to offer. Maybe you have, a community garden. Maybe you can offer computer labs or kitchens or things that could be used when running this project that would add value. So maybe specific equipment or space or whatever else that you have that you can use, that you can bring to the project that would add value. So it's a good idea to kind of have a sit down and think about that. What do we have to offer in terms of reach, in terms of capacity, and in terms of resources? And just even write a few lines on each, because it can make it so much easier to write about it kind of fluently and well in an application. The next thing then is CVs and bios. Lots of organizations will already kind of have their bios lined up, but if you don't, it's worth at least having bios of the key people who are going to be managing projects or who are likely to be managing projects. Because even if you're not specifically asked for it, if you're being asked in an application how you would manage a project, it can be really good to include a bio there of whoever's going to be the project manager. Because all of this is always about instilling confidence in the funder. They need to feel confident that if they're to give you this money, that it'll be managed well, that it'll achieve impact, it will deliver on their priorities. And so sometimes putting a face to that can be really, or putting a person to that can be really helpful. In terms of CVs, I found that this is pretty rare unless you're going for big grants. Sometimes they'll ask for CVs in that instance. And so it might not be necessary unless you are going for those bigger grants, but I just include them because they are such a pain to pull together in a tight deadline. It can take a really long time to get your colleagues to fill out CVs, and obviously you want them to look good and to be relatively, if you're attaching 3 CVs to an application, you want them to look relatively similar and kind of be of a uniform kind of quality. So I always try to do that in advance, just because they can take so long to get that it's worth having. They can be such a headache coming up to a tight deadline. So if you're going for bigger grants, it's definitely worth doing that. And the next thing, and I was kind of always hesitating about this because it might seem like kind of overkill, particularly if you're a smaller organization. Like, do you really need, project management methodology sounds like it could be very kind of complicated and big, but that's not necessarily the case at all. If you're a small organization and you're applying for small projects, your project management methodology might be 1 page long. It might just be that every time we get a grant, we have an initial meeting, we read over the application, we pick out the actions, we start scheduling the actions, we appoint a person who's responsible for that project, we create a file on our shared drive where we're going to store our project documentation and evidence and all of that kind of stuff. And then we schedule an interim meeting in the middle of the project just to check in on our progress, and then a final meeting towards the end to make sure that we've hit all of everything that we said we were going to do. And that's it. It can be something as straightforward as that. Obviously, if you're a large organization and you're going to be going for much bigger, more complex grants, you're going to want to have something a bit more comprehensive and detailed in place. But I think it's always worth having it, even if you are only going for a couple of €1,000 or something like that, because it not only does it make it, I suppose there's 2 reasons. First of all, it makes it so much easier to write confidently about how you manage projects in an application, because you have this methodology. So you're not making it up in response to the questions. It's a real methodology that you have. So you just need to talk about that in the application. And I think that really comes across to the funder. They can see, okay, this is obviously a very clear system that they have in place. But as well as that, it also means that when you do get projects, that they don't end up getting lost or slipping through the cracks, because it's not just about getting the funding, it's also about making sure that you're using the funding and really taking advantage of it as much as possible and using the opportunity. And I've definitely spoken to organizations in the past, and it's not, nobody does it on purpose, but it just kind of happens sometimes that you get funding and then everybody's so busy and they're thinking, okay, we'll get started on that project work really, really soon, just a couple more weeks. I just need to finish this other thing or whatever it is. And then, before you know it, a few months have gone by and the funder is looking for an update, and there's this mad scramble to try and get something done so that you can report back. And, not only is that kind of, bad practice in terms of, establishing good relationships with your funder, it's also a missed opportunity. And as I said, it's not through any kind of malice, it's just usually through lack of organization. So just having that methodology is really worth doing, and as far as I'm concerned anyway. So the next thing is daily rates and other standard costs. So if you're likely to be applying for staff time, it's worth kind of figuring out what is the daily rate for each of your staff members. Makes it easier when filling out the budget, and it also means that you're being consistent and not applying to the same funder with 2 different daily rates for the same person, just because of not having a uniform system for that. So it's really worth taking the time to do that. And then also kind of plotting any other standard costs. So if you're often applying for, maybe running workshops or something like that, have an idea of how much does that cost you, your venue rental, your printing, your teas, your coffees, all that kind of thing. Have all that stuff worked out in advance, so that it makes it so much easier when you're kind of building a budget for your project. Common supporting documents. So these are things like your audited accounts, your memoranda and arts, sometimes signed bank statements, things like that. CVs are an example of this as well. So, things like that where they exist within your organization. It's just easy to have them in one nice clear space, so that you can easily attach them to an application if necessary. And then the next thing is to know your USP, and have an explanation ready. So USP obviously is your unique selling point. And sometimes in the charity sector, we don't really think of ourselves as selling or having a USP or anything like that. But when it comes to grants, you are absolutely selling. You are 100% selling yourself to the funder. And what you really want to demonstrate is what's special about your organization, What do you do that nobody else can do? Why should they fund you and not that other organization? And I think that can sometimes sound a little bit harsh, but the fact is, there is enough funding to go around. You might get this grant and they'll get the next grant. It's not about, being needlessly competitive, but it's about really believing in your organization and giving yourself the best possible chance to be funded. And that's worth kind of sitting down and having a conversation with your team about, okay, what do we do really well? Sometimes we have a tendency to focus on what we're not doing well enough, but this is an opportunity to really sit down and think what makes us special. And having kind of a clear idea of that and kind of jotting down some notes about that can not just make it easier to talk about, again, confidently in your application, but it also makes it easier to, when you're reading a funding call, to see yourself, to see, okay, this is what we could offer to this funder. This, you can start to kind of see how your organization could help further their priorities because you're aware of what's unique and special about your organization. And so while, they're all the kind of preparing for success or grant readiness points, and while the reason for doing all of this is to try and alleviate pressure coming up to deadlines and streamline the process, and anybody who's ever done grants will know that anything that you can do to try and alleviate pressure coming up to a deadline is always worth doing. But what I've actually found is that, as well as it's streamlining the process, it can just be really useful in terms of your strategy. It really encourages you to look at your organization from a funder perspective and question what you have to offer and what it is you want to achieve through grants. So it's a worthwhile exercise to do, even apart from the fact that it's useful. But it really kind of brings me on to my next point, because we're talking about strategy, which is analyzing grant opportunities. So, whether you're completely new to grants and trying to decide what opportunities you want to go for, or if you are more experienced, but you're trying to be a little bit more strategic, you're rather than kind of jumping at every funding opportunity, you want to try and be a little bit more selective. This is something that might be of use to you. I invented this in an effort to try and make it a more objective process, because it takes the personal feelings out of it, and it looks, on the y-axis you're looking at, how impactful would this project be to one or more of the strategic objectives of your organization. And it is important that every single grant you consider links to at least one of your strategic objectives. So you kind of plot that on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not really at all, 10 being it would completely deliver on one or more of your strategic objectives. And then on the x-axis, you're looking at how resource and time intensive would the project be. 1 being it would be no effort at all, and 10 being, it would be an extreme effort. You're going to have to really invest. You might have to recruit new staff. There'd be, fundamental changes would need to happen in order to deliver on this project. And obviously, where your project falls on that scale, whether it's the dark green, or the dark orange, which is kind of a no-brainer, absolutely go for it, or the low potential option, or that kind of no man's land, it can hopefully try and help it be a little bit easier to decide, whether it's worth going for a grant opportunity or not. So the next thing, sorry, no, 1 second. So the next thing we're going to look at is the project development process. So you've identified an opportunity and you want to go for it. So what steps should you take? So again, this is a pretty kind of simple, straightforward system. If it's a huge grant, that might be, preparation might be going on for months. You might want to scale this up and add some more steps. Or if it's a very small grant, maybe you can kind of scale down the steps. But this is just a general process. So the very first thing you want to do is do your research. So you want to read the call very closely. I always find it helpful to actually print it out and read it in detail and highlight relevant pieces, because you don't want to find out later that there's some kind of criteria that excludes you after you've put in a lot of work. But also do research into your idea. If it's you that has an idea of, okay, I want to run this kind of program, I think this would be really good for this funding opportunity. Why do you think that? And what evidence is there to suggest that this would be good? And you want to put in that groundwork to justify, sometimes it can seem like, well, this is a no-brainer. Of course, it's a good idea, but there should always be some kind of concrete evidence to demonstrate why this would be a good and impactful idea. And the reason you want to do all of that research is because the next thing you're going to do is consult all of the relevant people, and they're going to ask you questions. So it's very good to have already done your research so that you can confidently answer them. So this might be your board, it might be your management, I would always really encourage it, if it's not going to be you personally delivering the project, involve the people who will be involved in delivering the project, because their insight is very important. It might be consulting clients or service users or whoever it is to try and get their inputs in it, to do a good consultation process to try and get feedback on your idea, and get their kind of inputs so that you can kind of help elaborate on your initial idea. Because the next one is step 3, which is to develop a concept note. And we'll look at a template for that now in a minute, and we'll circulate a template in the follow-up to this training that I use anyway, that might be of use, and you can adapt it for yourself. But this is just basically a template that encourages you to put structure to your idea. And this is a really important step. Never skip the concept note step, because if you do and you jump straight into trying to fill it into the application, you might think that your idea is clear, but it actually isn't. You haven't asked those vital questions and honed it down and really clarified it. And sometimes you need a few concept notes by the time you do that. So it's very important to do that step before you go tackling the application, to have a really clear idea, because sometimes if the idea isn't very well thought out, that can be clear in the application. It can be, from an evaluator's perspective, they can see that you're kind of making it up as you go along. So it's really worth doing that step. The next is to get buy-in. So whether it's from all those relevant people that you consulted, or your board, or whoever it is, you want to circulate your concept note and ensure that they understand the idea, that they get it, they understand the value of it, and that they're endorsing it, that they want to go with it. And then step 5 obviously is to get writing, and write your first draft of your application. Then you want to circulate that draft to whoever is the relevant people, and then submission. Now, as I said, if this is a much bigger project, there might be a few drafts circulated. There might be that step, those couple of steps might take a lot longer than if it's a very small grant, but that's a general kind of idea. And with submission, you always want to try and give yourself as much time as possible, ideally a day or 2 days before the deadline, because you have to remember the funder is going to be under pressure as well. Coming up to a deadline, they're going to be bombarded with questions. There can be technical issues, there can be all that kind of stuff. So you don't want to have wasted all of this work on some kind of technical problem with the submission. So try and do it in advance. Give yourself as much time as you possibly can, and submit the project the way you were asked to submit it. A lot of people kind of don't abide by the rules that the funder set out, and that's obviously going to instantly make a bad impression. So if you're asked to submit it in an email with a PDF, make sure you're not sending it as a Word document, that you actually do put it in as a PDF. So pay attention to those kind of criteria, because it is very important. This is the concept note that I mentioned, and as I said, you'll receive a template of this that you can adapt for your own needs, but it really encourages you to ask the questions and hone in on your idea and really clarify it. And it forces you to look at, well, what strategic objectives of your organization are addressed, and how does that match with the funder's priorities and objectives. So there should be clear overlap there. And it asks you to really define your target group and to be as specific as possible, and to look at, well, what are the key outputs, activities, all of that kind of stuff can be really useful, because it's very easy to get swept up in an idea. But this is ideas are kind of 10 a penny, like to actually make it a project is different. And these are the questions you need to ask to do that. And one thing I always kind of recommend, when even in the first instance, maybe even before you do your project concept note, is to use this kind of problem solution impact approach to frame your project. And we'll have a closer look. I have a very sophisticated illustration here to demonstrate this. But basically, the problem solution, when you've got this big idea and you're trying to structure it, try and roughly break it down into problem, solution, impact. So the problem, what is it? What impact is it having? What will happen if it continues? And then solution, what is it? Why does it work? What evidence is there to support that it works? And again, it's always, don't ever take it that, well, this is a no-brainer, of course this would work. No, there should always be some evidence. There should be some kind of precedent or some kind of proof that this solution that you're offering is going to work. And then impact, what specific objectives and results will you achieve? And you want to try and be bold and leave the funder feeling optimistic. So if you use that approach when kind of designing your project idea, and then try and communicate it in the project application itself, the idea is that the funder is kind of brought through, the evaluator is brought through a bit of a journey. So you want to not depress them, but certainly, communicate the gravity of the problem that you're facing, and don't take it as a given that they understand that problem. we all work very closely in our specific communities and understand the nuances and the problems. Doesn't mean the funder will. So make sure that they fully understand, like, why is this a problem? What impact is it having? What'll happen if it continues? All of that. And so you're going to a little bit depress them there. Then you're going to offer them a ray of light, a little ray of hope, and get them kind of excited and interested because you're offering a solution to this. So that's kind of lift them up a little bit. And then you kind of want to wow them and impress them with the impact. So you're kind of bringing them on a journey. And that's the kind of thing that will kind of stick with a funder when they're evaluating a bunch of projects. At the end of the day, they're people as well, and they want to be, they want to feel hopeful and excited by the project, and that's what you're trying to achieve. I put in bold the objectives and results there because I just wanted to kind of do a quick side note on terminology, which I think can sometimes be a little bit confusing. Even though we all know what these words, goals, objectives, results, outcomes, outputs, like, we all know what they mean individually. But certainly when I started writing grants, I would often find it a little bit challenging to kind of answer questions where they asked me about goals and objectives, like, and what are the outcomes and results of your project. And I was kind of like, oh, well, aren't those kind of the same thing? And I think it's actually very valid, because I found that sometimes funders themselves can use this kind of terminology interchangeably, but having a clear understanding yourself can really help. And I kind of set about that. And this is my system for understanding that terminology that I came up with, because it makes it easier for me to write confidently about goals versus results versus outputs, all that kind of stuff. So the first thing is your goal, which is a big, ambitious, long-term desired results. This can be like your vision for the project. So I'll use like a fictional example for the wheel, for example. Like, we could be writing a project where, our goal is to significantly reduce burnout in staff working in the nonprofit charity sector. So that's the goal of our project. The objectives then are the specific, measurable, shorter term kind of actions in a project. So for example, in order to achieve that goal, the fictional project, the burnout project that we're going to do, we might conduct some research, we might develop a new training program, we might pilot that program, develop a set of work-life balance principles, or create a policy template that organizations can adapt. So they might be the specific objectives that we're going to do in order to deliver on our overall goal. The results then are the predictable, measurable results that can be measured against key performance indicators. And this is really important. This is probably the most important part of the grant, because at all times, you have to give key performance indicators. People can often really shy away from that because they're worried about putting definite numbers, and they're worried about, oh God, what if we can't reach this? But you have to give something, because from an evaluator's perspective, it might be the best sounding project ever, but like, are you going to reach 10 people? Are you going to reach 100 people? Like, how do they know if this is going to be actually impactful and value for money, unless you give them something solid to kind of latch onto? So with results, you're always looking at the numbers, and this allows you then to evaluate your project in the end and decide, well, did you reach the results that you said you were going to reach? So again, our fictional burnout project, we might say, X number of people will participate in the training. We're going to achieve X percent, 80% satisfaction rate across all of our pilot participants. X number of organizations are going to adapt our policy. So we'll put kind of very specific, tangible KPIs attached to each of our results. Outcomes then are a little bit more complex. These are kind of unpredictable possible results that can come and that you can only really speculate about. I don't really like talking about outcomes in projects because it's pointless. You can't measure them. So, but sometimes it can help to create a vision of what it is you want to achieve. And certainly if they ask specifically about them, you have to talk about them. So, for, again, our fictional burnout project, possible outcomes would be, reduced staff turnover, improvement in service delivery. Obviously, less stress, less burnt out staff are going to do, are going to work more impactfully and more happily. And then also better professional development in the sector. If people stay longer in the sector because they're not being burnt out, then that will lead to the overall professional development. So these are things that we can't possibly measure, but they could very well be outcomes of the project. And then there's outputs. So these are the tangible things produced by the project. So it could be, again, the burnout project, it could be the research report itself, the training program itself, or the policy template itself. So that's an example. It's a bit of an aside, but it was just something that I really struggled with when I first started, and it really helped for me to kind of break that down. And it can really help when structuring projects as well, to think about, well, what is my goal? What are my objectives? What are my results, outcomes, outputs, things like that. So it all helps to kind of clarify that kind of project terminology. I'm just going to give a little warning here that I've got a few slides. I've got, well, about 10 minutes left, so we hope we have lots of time for Q&A at the end. But just to, if you have any questions, try and put them in now, make sure that we have time to get to them. The next thing is the rules. So as I said, these are the rules that I put together. They're in no particular order. It pretty much reiterates things that we've already covered more or less, but I just kind of wanted to take the opportunity to hammer them home. And these are all things that I try to abide by whenever I'm writing a grant. The first thing in preparation is, as I said, read the guidelines. If it helps to print it out, because you're more likely to skim read on a screen, then do that. Do your research. Don't take it as a given that people will understand that this is a good idea. There needs to be proof that it's a good idea, whether it's because you ran a previous program that was very successful and you want to build on that, or whether there's a model that another organization has used that you want to take and adapt, and whatever it is, whether there's academic research or policy research or whatever it is that demonstrates that this is the need and this is something that could work. You always want to be trying to tie your project in with evidence. Align with strategic objectives. So you always want to make sure that anything that you're doing is meaningfully contributes to one or more of your strategic objectives. And this is all about, trying to take a more strategic approach to grants. Sometimes it can be very tempting to think, oh, well, we could definitely do this, even if it's not going to add to the strategic objectives, we can do it, and it would be good to, have that funding. We really need funding. But that's kind of a very risky road to go down, because the more you end up getting into the habit of doing that, the more you can be tied up. I mean, projects are time consuming and demanding. And if you get tied up in projects that aren't meaningfully furthering a strategic objective of yours, then, you're losing sight of your mission, and it's going to detract away from your core work. So you always want to be aware of that. When it comes to writing, the first thing is to remember that it's not about you. Even if you're looking at this call thinking, oh my God, this would be amazing for our organization, we would love to do this, it would help us with this and that, like, that's great, and absolutely put that into the application in some way, shape or form. Make sure the funder understands that this would be of strategic value to you as well, and it would really help your organization. But remember, first and foremost, it's about the funder's priorities, what they want to achieve. Because they have a plan for this funding and the impact that they want to achieve with this money. And you have to remember to place their priorities front and center at all times. You're saying how you can help them to achieve their priorities, their objectives for this money, rather than talking about, but it would be so great for our organization and it would really help with this. It's their money, and it's about them, and it's about their priorities that they want to further. So you want to put that front and center in your application as you're writing. The KISS principle, which some of you might have heard of. So this is sometimes called keep it simple stupid, or keep it stupid simple. So this is very important, that the more complexity, it's easy to happen when you're kind of excited about a project. You're like, oh, and then we can do this and this, and maybe we could introduce a little bit of this. And, what started as a simple idea can kind of become a bit of a monster after a while. And the more complexity, the more components and that you add to an idea, the more likely it is that you're going to kind of lose the evaluator at some point, because they just don't get it. So the best thing you can possibly do is keep your project simple and see it as just one step in an overall strategy. No one funding opportunity is ever really going to be your opportunity to deliver, everything and to achieve everything. It's always useful to kind of think about this as keep this project simple, straightforward, attainable, ambitious, but attainable. And then use it as the first step on an overall journey to achieve, our vision. So it can be tempting to try and throw everything into a project and see this as your opportunity to deliver on all of these things that you've wanted to do. But in reality, that's usually not doable. It's usually not something that you can even do within a 1 or 2 or even 3 or 4 year project. And it should always just be a step in the process. So you want to try and keep your idea simple and clear to the funder so that they get it. Be specific. This is important across the board. So as I said, it's things like KPIs, like being clear about, how many people are you going to reach? All of that kind of stuff is very important. But also be specific in terms of your target group. So for example, if you're working with people experiencing homelessness, rather than saying, oh, we're going to, our target group is homeless people, like, which specific, are you reaching men? Are you reaching women? Are you reaching people who are older or younger? Try and hone in as clearly as possible on your target group, on your results, on the impact that you want to achieve. Be detailed and specific, because if you keep it all very broad, it can just seem a little bit woolly to the funder, and like it's not a very tight, concise project. The next one is read and answer the question, the keyword method. I don't have time to go into this today. If we were doing a live training, I would, but I can send you a handout for this. So often in an application, they will ask you, 3 or 4 questions in one question. So it's always about kind of breaking down the question. It kind of comes back to the leave insert, I'm sure, where everybody was told to read the question, answer the question. It's really important. This is your opportunity. They have evaluation criteria there, and they want to see that you hit every single thing that they asked you in the question. So it's very important to kind of break it down. And a way of doing that is to kind of look at the question, highlight the keywords, and then structure your answer according to that. And as I said, I have a handout that demonstrates that I'll send in the follow-up, or that Sinead will send in the follow-up to everybody. So that's a really important point. Assume the reader knows nothing. I kind of alluded to this before. You're all experts in your field, and you know really well the specific social issue, and it can seem like, well, everybody knows this and this is a no-brainer, but that's not necessarily the case. You should always assume that the reader knows absolutely nothing about the specific social problem that you're tackling, and your specific idea that you're proposing. So it's that kind of explain it like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old type thing. Mirroring language, a balancing act. So this is where, the language that you will read in the call, the kind of terminology that they use, the way that they describe the issue, you want to try and echo that back in as much as possible throughout the application, to kind of say, like, look, we're on the same page here. We're understanding that the problem in the same manner. So you want to kind of mirror or echo that language back at them, but you don't want to go too far where you're kind of copying and pasting chunks of text or anything like that, where it might seem like you're kind of pandering a little bit. So you want to echo language back in as much as possible and use their kind of terminology, but keep it balanced. Understanding the whole picture, and I kind of call this invoking your inner toddler. So this is asking who, why, when, what, where, like, and what you'll actually find is that as you're describing the project, and you can do this during the concept note phase, as you're describing the project, it kind of would be annoying trying to think, well, who's going to do this, and when are they going to do it, and why are we doing it, and how are we going to do it? It can almost be a little bit annoying, and you kind of think, oh, we'll just figure that out, but actually that's what you want to get through in your application, is to demonstrate that we've thought about all of these factors. We know what we're doing, we know when we're going to do it, we have a timeline in place, we know how we're going to do it, all of that kind of thing. So you need to keep asking yourself those questions, even if it's kind of annoying. And this is just simple kind of good writing technique, is to use the active voice. So this is all about instilling confidence in the funder and presenting yourself as an authority on your topic and on this project idea, that you have the capacity and expertise to deliver on it. So you want to use that active voice because it really demonstrates that kind of confidence and assertiveness and authority. So rather than saying, a new program will be created, say we will create a new program. So it's kind of taking ownership and communicating confidence. So that's just a simple kind of writing technique, but it does really make a difference. On a similar note, a little pet hate of mine, remove the we think, we believe, we feel. That's number one, it's kind of bad writing because it's redundant. But number two, also, like, you're trying to assert yourself as the authority on this subject. So it's not, we think this is an issue. This is an issue. You're saying it's an issue. And like I said, because you've done your research, you can demonstrate it. You can prove that it's an issue. So try and kind of remove that, I call that kind of watery language, that kind of watery, not very confident language from your application. Subheadings or headings, subheadings, and bullet points, avoid blocks of text. Evaluators are people too. Nobody wants to get a wall of text that they have to sift through. If they can avoid it at all, ingratiate yourself to them by making it easy to read your application. And it's just good practice in writing. It's more concise, it's more impactful, to use that headings, subheadings, bullet points, and it kind of ties back to that keyword method for every question. Highlight the keywords. What are they actually asking you here? And then structure your answer in a very clear way, and using those things that will make it easier for them to read. And then, of course, proofread. You can't, often it's very hard to proofread your own work. So, try to get somebody else to proofread it if you can. But it is very important if you're trying to communicate kind of an assertive level of and quality and all that kind of stuff. You want to make sure that there's not kind of silly mistakes in there. So just a very quick note on success. It's fantastic when it happens, but what's important is to, kind of comes back to that project management methodology that I mentioned at the beginning. It's about really taking advantage of the opportunity that you've been given, making sure there's a system in place to immediately kind of get the project going and start making progress. Really try and see it as an opportunity to build on a new relationship with a funder, or to develop an existing relationship with a funder. And just as a rule, I would try and avoid doing the bare minimum. Like maybe they ask for a report at the end of the project, but try and keep them updated. Focus on the quality of your report. Don't just do a general report. Try and make it really good, and try and really focus on quality in your project activities. Because if they see, okay, this is an organization who ran an excellent project, really impactful, they went above and beyond, they've really demonstrated, impact, they really wowed us, then they're of course more likely to fund you again. So don't just see it as, okay, we've got our money now, that's great. It's an ongoing kind of relationship building thing. And then the next thing is rejection, which happens. It's inevitable. It's part of grant writing. Sometimes, particularly if you put your kind of heart and soul into an application, it can be really devastating. But don't take it personally. I mean, it doesn't mean that your project wasn't good. It just meant that maybe that wasn't the right opportunity for it, or there was somebody else who was just that little bit better. So don't take rejection personally. And it can be very hard sometimes to, when you've been rejected, the impulse is to just be like, okay, move on, forget about it, kind of thing. But in actuality, always try and ask for feedback. Always, they don't always give it. Sometimes they'll give really detailed feedback. Sometimes they won't really give any, but it's always worth asking, because it's an opportunity to learn. And the work that you put into the application is never wasted, because you did a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, you built your capacity to write about it. It means that if another opportunity comes up, you can use all of that. It was never wasted. You can use all of that copy that you put together. You can use that concept note again. So try not to view it like that, and remember that rejection is just part of the game. So we're coming up on, we have a few minutes left for Q&A. So I'm going to have a look now. What should be in descriptions? Okay, so I'm just having a quick look at these questions. So what kind of things should be in your descriptions? So this is your long and short description of your organization. So I would say either your vision or your mission should be very clearly up there. So you should start with the overarching, this is what our organization was set up for, and this is what we want to achieve, and this is who we are. Then there might be kind of a short summary of it, and this is how we do it. These are our objectives, or these are our activities, and how we deliver on that. And then maybe a quick note on the impact that has. So for the WHEEL, you could be, the WHEEL is the National Association for Ireland for Community Volunteer Organisations, Charities, Social Enterprises. And then our vision is an Ireland, a thriving community and voluntary sector in the heart of a fair and just Ireland. So you're kind of doing that overarching stuff. To do this, we have different strands, and that's all on our website. We have our policy strand, we have our training strand, we have all of this kind of thing. So what we actually do, and then our impact is, we have 2,000 members. Every year we train, I think this year it was, I don't know how many thousand people because of COVID and remote training, but try and talk a little bit, wow them in like the impact that you have. So you can kind of use that as a general across the board rule and kind of scale it up and down. If you've only got 50 words, obviously you have to try and squeeze as much of that in as you can. But if you have 500 words, you can use it a little bit more effectively. So that's an example, I suppose, of long, short description. Would you give an example of a good USP? Absolutely, yeah. So a good unique selling point is, I'd actually almost come back to the reach that you have. I kind of mentioned that at the beginning. So, a good USP would be you are an absolute expert on the specific community that you represent, whether that's a geographical community, like your community centre, I'm based in Longford here. So, your Ballymahan Community Centre, we are known and trusted by our local residents. We have a unique reach into the community. We run all of these programs. Nobody else serves this specific community like us. And that's very true in Brala to say. Or if you are representing not a geographic community, but a community of people, a community of marginalized people, whatever it is, that you have a unique, unparalleled reach and presence into that community. We are known and trusted by them. We are known to deliver quality services. We are known to deliver on impact. And that's what makes you special. That's what makes your organization different. For the wheel, I suppose you're looking at our network, our reach, our members, all of that kind of thing. That's what's unique and special about us. But for your own organization, it's about kind of sitting down and thinking about what's something that we do that nobody else does, that just is special and different about us. So I hope that kind of answers that question. But it really comes back to that reach, capacity, and assets, or what was it, reach, capacity, resources that you have. What do you have, or what kind of relationship with your clients or beneficiaries do you have that is just doesn't exist elsewhere and is special? Some tips on language and presenting analysis of the feasibility of a grant would be helpful. I think funders can often spot pitfalls at the outset, as they are so familiar with it, while management and board may just want to apply for everything and see what comes. Okay, some tips on presenting. Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I'm wondering how I can kind of answer it very succinctly. But yeah, I suppose it could be, using that kind of, using the kind of graph that I presented. It's quite easy to kind of analyze, okay, well, this is the opportunity, and this is what it would demand from us in terms of resources. This is where it falls in an objective scale, and to try and demonstrate, I suppose, from that, like this can be a short document where you kind of present that and then show where it falls on that graph, and then kind of say, look, objectively speaking, this is worth our time or not worth our time. And I understand what you mean, that like, well, I think I'm understanding what you mean, that your management and board can say, just go for everything. And then you put effort and time into applications that don't yield results, because the funders can quickly see through the fact that, well, actually, this isn't very relevant. So I think, it's a delicate kind of balancing act. All you can do is present the facts and present an objective analysis of it. And as I said, just outlining what is it, what would be the demands, this is where it falls within an objective scale, using that graph, and then hope that your management and board see that, like, this isn't a valuable investment of our time. It's not going to deliver on impact. It's not worth us putting this amount of time and effort into it, or it could detract from our core work even if we did get it. So it's not an easy question to answer. It's kind of about a cultural shift within your organization, but certainly, presenting your analysis like that is one way of going about it, and then just hoping that that's understood. So I hope that's helps with that question. What's the best way to find grants that are out there? Well, that's a very good, somebody mentioned that, because I will get to that very soon. I have some funding supports just in my next couple of slides. So I'll present them very soon. Template of how to keep track of what you applied for. That's really good, actually. I hadn't thought about that. So certainly we will think about that. But like, actually, well, we use something where it's kind of like a pipeline tracker. Yeah, I suppose I do actually have something like this, but I just didn't think of presenting it in this training. So I have a pipeline tracker where I have potential, and it's just an Excel document. So potential, in preparation, pending, as in pending results, and then successful and unsuccessful. And I have, I think, specific headings for each of those. So like, the funder, the topic, the priority, the strategic objective addressed, and then like the amount applied for, or something like that. And it makes it very easy that I can, once projects are pending, I can either move them to successful or unsuccessful, and I can very easily see the total amount of funding applied for, the total amount that was successful, and the total amount that was unsuccessful, so I can kind of have an idea of the success rate as well. So I might actually think, if we can wait until Monday, Sinead, for our follow-up, then I can certainly create like an Excel template of that and circulate it along with the follow-up. That might be useful. Somebody said, you mentioned having daily rates within your grant application. could you expand a bit more on this? What do you mean by daily rates? Thanks. Well, I suppose that kind of depends on your organization, how you go about calculating it. Just the one, I'm always coming from an EU background, because that was where I first started with grants, and I've done other ones since. But back in the old system, pre-2014 of EU, when everything was based on actual costs, the daily rate was your total salary plus your the expenses that it for the employer, so insurance costs and PRSI and things like that. So the total amount of money, not just the salary, but the total amount of money that it costs the organization to employ that person. So you have that final figure, and then it's the total number of working days. So it's whether it's Monday to Friday, so however many working days there are in a year, I can't remember, minus public holidays, minus annual leave and things like that. So what you're trying to figure out is how many actual days will this person be working, and then you divide those two, and that's your daily rate. Now that's the system that I use. Other organizations would use just a lump sum daily rate based on whether they're officer, manager, director, based on where they are within the hierarchy of the organization. There's no exact way of doing that, but if you're basing it on actual costs, that's a way of doing that. So yeah, somebody says that this has been helpful, so that's great. A small organization in terms of staff and local focus. How many grant applications would an organization potentially submit in a year? Should there be a mix of big, small funders? Well, for one thing, I would say if you're completely new to the nonprofit sector, well, welcome, and definitely reach out directly to the wheel and we can give you more tailored advice. But absolutely, there's no real kind of minimum or maximum number of grants. I would kind of recommend pacing yourself in terms of, can be tempted to go for everything, but think about it in terms of your strategic development. Is it adding value? Can you manage it? Are you going to become, apply for everything and then, maybe you get funded and that's great, but do you have the capacity to deliver it? You need to be kind of asking yourself those questions. I always kind of appreciate or recommend taking like a strategic methodical approach to grants and kind of gradually developing your capacity, because you don't want to take on too many and then be delivering poor quality grants that maybe damage your reputation with funders. So, there is no exact science about doing it, or about whether you should be going for big funding or lots of small funding or anything like that. Happy to have a chat with you in a bit more detail about your unique situation, but there's no exact answer to that, other than I would really recommend taking a strategic approach as possible and focusing on not just getting funding in, but being able to deliver really quality, impactful projects. It'll be better for your organization, it'll be better for your beneficiaries, and it'll be better for your relationship with those funders going forward. Is there a particular terminology that we always include, and buzzwords that would be help your application? Should you request feedback if your application is successful or unsuccessful? So I think I addressed that. Absolutely, always ask for feedback. In terms of terminology, I kind of would hark back to that goals, results, outcomes, outputs. That's really helpful for kind of structuring it. And, you want to make sure that they understand that you get that, that, you get how this project works. And you want to, as I said in the previous slides, just echo back the kind of general terminology that they use in their call to demonstrate that you understand the problem. But in terms of buzzwords, I'd actually kind of recommend not doing that in as much as possible. Try and keep your simple, straightforward language that's easy to read, that's easy to understand, even if they're not really deep into the specific challenge that you're addressing. It's really worth trying to do that in as much as possible. Just Sinead, I'm coming up on time here. I'm going to ask you, should I keep going? I'm happy to stay on for another few minutes and address more questions, or should I follow up afterwards by email or something?
That's up to you. I'm happy to stay on for a couple more minutes. Obviously, some people may drop off, unfortunately, as we had just scheduled for the hour. But if you want to keep going for a couple more minutes.
Yeah, sure. We'll try and get to, there's a few more questions in here. I'll try and get to them. I totally understand if people need to go. We're still recording, so they can catch up on this bit later. But just because there's more questions than usual, sometimes I get no questions at the end of this training. So we'll take the opportunity and answer them where we can. But yeah, just on that buzzwords, I would avoid that. You want to use things like your objectives, outcomes, goals, all that kind of stuff, but try and keep your language simple, plain, straightforward. You have to remember they're reading a lot of applications and they will really appreciate that. So the CUNA Centre is a small wellness centre open to all, but primarily for some who are more vulnerable in our communities, frontline workers, etc. We don't really have projects We are more often looking for funding to offset centre costs or to fund treatments for clients who can't afford it. And a lot of funding opportunities are project-based, so it's difficult to meet that criteria. Yeah, absolutely. I totally understand. That's Maura Burke. Totally understand that. This is, I think, a flaw in funding, that there doesn't seem to be a lot of funding for what we call operational work, like what you're describing. It does tend to be project focused. And I think that's an issue. That's something that the Wheel is obviously campaigning hard for, is for multi-annual operational funding for the sector, because how can you even deliver on projects if you can't even have your operational work in order? So, I mean, that is an issue, and there's no clear answer to it. Usually it's things like working with corporates, working with like doing fundraising. They're the kind of things that can help with operational costs. With grants, you really are more often than not looking at projects, and that's an issue. Now, there is ways to kind of rethink your services. So could this be framed as a project? Like maybe it is ongoing work, but maybe we could, frame it as a project, add a little bit of new innovation to it, and it will help kind of fund that project for the lifetime, or fund that service for the lifetime of the project, and will enhance it a little bit. So there's a little bit of creativity in how you view your operational work, and whether things could be reframed as projects, obviously adding some kind of extra value to it. So there it does have to be a project in a sense, but rethink which services could be reframed as projects, or is there work that could be done with grant funding that would free up what would have been, free up your core costs to go into operational. So look, Maura, it's not a perfect answer. It's something that the Wheel has been pushing for years and years and years, and will continue to push for. And I think it's slowly being more understood that this is very important. But it is about trying to be kind of look at your services as creatively as possible, reframe things where possible, look at how grants can free up things that would otherwise have been draining your kind of core costs. And then looking into other things. So like I said, corporate sponsorship, fundraising, things like that can really help with operational work. Is there a list of strategic objectives or guide that can help you to keep focused and clear to the funder? So the strategic objectives, I suppose, should be the ones from your organization's strategic plan. I'm pretty sure we're doing a funding, and Sinead, you might know in the next few weeks, about helping to determine your vision and mission and values, if that's not something you have already, your kind of strategic plan. But this is the strategic objectives of your organization will be unique to your organization, but there is training that's provided by the Wheel that will help organizations to design that for themselves. And then there's they're often called objectives or priorities of the funder, and they will be listed quite clearly on the call. And ideally, you want a Venn diagram where there's your strategic objectives and there's the priorities of the funder, and there's that sweet spot in the middle where they perfectly overlap. If you are finding that you have to kind of pander to the funder, that you're not, none of those priorities are really in line with your strategic objectives, but you want the funding, so you're kind of just writing all about their priorities and it doesn't really link with their strategic objectives, that's a mistake. You don't really want to do that. Whereas if you're finding that you really think that this could have potential for your strategic objectives, but it's not clear the relationship with the funder's priority, and you're having to kind of shoehorn it in a little bit, I mean, they're going to see through that straight away. Like, more often than not, it's not worth doing. You're going to put time into an application that they're going to immediately see isn't linked to your organization or your project idea. So yeah, if you're interested in more kind of training around how to develop strategic objectives for your organization, I would get in touch with the Wheel and look at our training section at the website. I'm pretty sure there's one coming up soon. Is there a comprehensive list of all the grant, trust, foundation giving organizations published anywhere? We'll get to that soon. I have some resources that are available. Have you found funders to support services versus building projects? Maureen Lynch, yeah, I think this is what we addressed before. It's an ongoing issue. Unfortunately, most grants are not operational, don't cover operational costs. Many grants request being a registered charity. Is there opportunity for very small community organizations that aren't? Does registering as a charity bring extra costs like auditing? I know that registering as a charity is, it's going to bring around extra kind of responsibilities as a charity. I would recommend you get in touch with our skills team about that. Actually, my colleague Lynn at wheel.ie can help you with in terms of whether you need to set up as a charity, whether that's a good decision for your organization, what are the benefits. So she's the expert on that. I won't touch on that. But I know that there are plenty of funding opportunities that don't require for you to be a registered charity. So again, I'll look at some resources Very soon I have some slides. Somebody else asking about Irish EU funding resources. I'll get to that very soon. Great. Can you discuss further, please? Your objection to blocks of text. So yeah, so Hugh from Bernardo's asked about what is my objection to blocks of text. I mean, I would kind of say I hate to receive an email that's a block of text, that doesn't have paragraphs, that doesn't like summarize in points. We're all very busy people. Nobody likes to get emails like that. Never mind if you have an application that is potentially, I submitted an application on Wednesday that was 65 pages long. So nobody wants to read that. It's just, you want to try and make it an easy process for the evaluator to quickly read and skim and see the main points of your project, that it's not buried in a wall of text. And you have to remember, as I said, they're human beings. They're reading a lot of applications. This is you want to try and make it as easy for them as possible. And I think on some kind of human fundamental level, it does kind of make them think like, okay, these people are a bit more professional, more organized, more methodical, all of that kind of thing. Absolutely, like for me anyway, on a human level, that would ingratiate me to somebody who was writing to me if they took the time to do that. So I can only imagine evaluator would be the same. Do you have permission to use your graph? Absolutely, go for it. Pipeline tracker, yeah, I'm going to put together a pipeline or a template for that and send it on. So many county council grants don't take labour costs into account. Why? You're right, that's Paul Halton. I have no idea why. Actually, many grants won't allow for staff costs, and I just think it's mind-boggling. I don't understand how people expect these things to happen without people putting time into it. I think sometimes it's to do with, the cynical side of me would be to this idea that everything within the sector should be delivered by volunteers. And absolutely volunteers are incredible and their time adds huge value to the sector, but it's not realistic to expect everything, particularly large scale projects, to be delivered by volunteers. It's just not fair or sustainable. So I don't know the answer why. It's a real shame. Again, it's something that we are trying to push at the wheel in terms of our asks around multi-annual funding, sustainable funding for the sector. Does we have any support for startups in search of grants? I'll get onto my, we do have our training program, obviously, that can kind of help to develop some trainings like this and others that will help to develop organizations' capacity. But then I have funding supports that I'm going to get onto very soon. Are you finding there are fewer grants out there in 2021 to previous years? I don't know. I don't know whether I'd be the right person to ask about that, because I think Paul, our information manager, does most of our grants research. So I'm not really sure on that, but I mean, possibly I think things paused a little bit. There was an influx of funding when COVID first happened, and then people are, maybe a little bit taxed or exhausted from it, and kind of re-strategizing after the year that it's been. So I'm not really sure about that one. Can the wheel provide one-to-one advice? Absolutely. Please do get in touch. Can we look at the slides of opportunities while answering questions? Okay, yeah, we'll do that now. Let me just see. I might have to leave it there. There's a lot more people. So in terms of funding, so what we have is Funding Point. So this is the best possible thing that you can do in order to keep up to date on what funding is out there. So it's 800 plus grants, dozens of funding deadlines. You get it all in an exclusive 1-month newsletter. So we do all of that research and present it in a condensed, straightforward way that you can easily kind of skim in your inbox. It is a paid subscription, but there's discounted members or discounts for members of the wheel, and it's very reasonable. So that's a very kind of practical thing that you can do to make sure that you're not the one having to do all of this research, that you can access Funding Point on a monthly basis and see what's out there. And then the other thing is Access Europe. So this is the program that I manage. This is a program funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs, and we provide free updates on, so for Funding Point you get all of the EU updates plus all of the national updates and everything else that's relevant to funding and fundraising and things like that. Whereas for Access Europe you get all the EU updates for free, and you also get one-to-one advice, training, events. So that'll, if you sign up to that, it's accesseurope.ie. You'll get that newsletter every month, and you'll get information about more trainings, more development opportunities. You can access one-to-one advice. So Funding Point is for everything, including EU funds. So it's well worth signing up to. And Access Europe is uniquely European, but it also includes other kind of things as well. So training and advice and things like that. So it's really worth signing up to them. So I'm just looking, I'm wondering, I think I've got too many of them and it's 10 past. I'm just going to have a very quick skim of a couple more questions. That is it in terms of the slides. If people do need to go, that's completely understandable. So I might emphasize the importance of where do we seek core funding? Yeah, this keeps coming up again and again. So there is opportunities for core funding from government, from some grants, but it's in general, if you're looking for core funding from grants, from projects, that's going to be very challenging. There are very few opportunities. As I said, the wheel is working on this, and it's something we continue to kind of advocate for, multi-annual funding for the sector. But grants is usually not the right place to look for it. In your experience, are larger and historically well-funded organisations less likely to be awarded small-scale grant opportunities, or are opportunities generally an equal playing field? That's a good question, Ms. Dion Curran. I mean, I think in some ways, you kind of have to ask yourself, is this worth going for these small-scale grants? Whether you should be more strategically focusing on larger grants as you develop and as you become a well-funded organization. I think in general, if anything, sometimes the larger, historically more well-funded grants can kind of come in and sweep up those smaller grants quite easily. But it's whether you need to whether you should be considering whether we need to engage in multiple small grants and deal with all of that kind of administration that goes into each grant, or whether we need to strategically look at kind of bigger grants and invest more time in those. So that's kind of an internal decision that you have to make. I wouldn't say that they're at a disadvantage or anything like that. Sometimes they can be at a big advantage. It really depends on the perspective of the funder. Maybe emphasize the importance of reporting, as you can really undermine the credibility of your organization if this is not done. Absolutely. Some organizations run out of energy when the project is complete and they're chasing new funding. Absolutely. I don't have the name of that person there, but excellent point. It does not end with getting the grant. It's a relationship that you're building with your funder. That's very important. You want to establish a relationship of excellence and quality going forward. And it's not about, even, and it's a very good point about running out of energy at the end of a grant or at the end of a project and just immediately thinking about the next funding. Not only do you need to report to your funder and really wow them with an excellent final report and demonstrate that quality, but even internally for your own organization, it's really worth just taking time to think about what were the lessons that we learned from that project. What do we need to consider going forward? What worked? What didn't work? What do we definitely want to keep doing? What do we definitely not want to keep doing? So that's very important. I'm just excellent point from that person. So small organization again, grant sourcing applications take a lot of time. For small organization, I'm the only person looking completing the same. One hope regarding grant opportunities would be fantastic. So yeah, that's funding point, absolutely. And it is difficult. Grants do take up so much time, and it's a big investment, and it can feel so frustrating then when it doesn't pay off. So that's where maybe being more strategic, using that graph as much as possible, really linking everything in with your strategic priorities, and using things like funding point to kind of try and streamline the process, and even doing that, grant readiness thing so that it's easier when you do have to apply. All of that kind of stuff can really help. What can you do when a funder says that they cannot give you feedback on a failed application due to a large number of applications? There's nothing really you can do to that person. There's no name there, but all you can do is ask. Sometimes they give great feedback, sometimes they won't even answer you. I've definitely had that experience. And I do understand from a funder's perspective, how difficult it might be to give detailed feedback to everybody. So there's nothing you can do, but I would always just recommend asking, and because you never know when you might get something really good, or even just kind of saying, like, if it's too difficult to give written feedback, maybe we can have a quick call. If it's a local funder, they might be able to be willing to do that and kind of give you more verbal feedback over the phone if that's easier. But all you can do is ask and hope that they'll give it. Recently, I noticed putting in a percentage for administrative costs. Would you recommend doing this? It depends. I mean, if the funding, it depends on what they request and the parameters that they push into the funding available. I mean, if they cover staff costs and if there's a percentage for overheads, I can't remember what the percentage we usually use is, but yeah, if you want to put in a percentage for overheads and administrative costs, absolutely, it's do that. if the funding allows it. But yeah, you want to hopefully cover all of your costs that you're going to have. If the word count is very low in an application, should you still try to use the headings and bullet points, even in sections that might have 50 to 100 words? Clean McCarthy, I mean, you know, anybody who writes a lot of grants will know the pain that is word counts and character counts, and how sometimes they ask you to describe you and everything about your project and everything you've ever done in 50 words, and it's just endlessly frustrating. And you know, in that case, you know, make the word count work for you. Obviously, you know, if it just doesn't work to use headings and bullet points, then don't use them. Sometimes I do think for small word counts, bullet points can be really helpful, because you cut out any of the other kind of additional words that are just taking up space. So yeah, all you can do is try and make the word count available work for you in as much as possible, and be as creative as you can to stuff as much content into sometimes very limited you know, availability. So don't feel tied to that, but if at all possible, try and present it in a way that is just, you're just always thinking about how easy it is to read, how easy it is to skim, how clear is your point here. So can you explain who the project concept note is for? Is it for yourself only, or is it something you share with others in the organization, because other departments get buy-in? It's kind of both, Cleena. That question's also from Cleena. For just personally writing a project, I find it extremely helpful, because as I said, it focuses me to focus on my idea, hone it in, clarify it, streamline it, and that can be really helpful in terms of turning this big fuzzy idea into an actual real project. So for you, just personally, it's a good exercise. For me anyway, it is. But then it also becomes a project communication tool. So you can use it to communicate within your organization, to send it on to, you know, your board or to your colleagues and ask for feedback and things like that. So it's useful internally within your organization like that. But then it can also be useful for communicating with partners. So I write a lot of European projects, and we are trying to build European partnerships. And these are sometimes people that I don't even know and that I'm only reaching out to for the first time. And having that concept note attached to that email and say, you know, this is the project that we have in mind. You know, it's all super clear. It can be really good. So it's both an internal kind of structuring thoughts tool, and then also a project communication tool. Readmin costs, this has been recently on application forms. Yeah, so that's a good thing. I mean, it's promising to see that maybe funders are moving more towards funding more staff costs and the overhead costs and the administration costs. So absolutely, if you can account for those, do that. That's, you know, make sure you put it into your budget. And be realistic in terms of, like, you obviously want to offer value for money. Of course, that's really important, but don't undersell yourself either. Your time is worth money. Your time and your expertise are valuable. So don't undersell yourself in your budget. Are there special considerations for a subgroup of a national organization with its own constitution, bank accounts, and given its own goal in applying for a grant? I don't know if I really understand that question, Miles. Do feel free to email me, at.wheel.ie, if to clarify. But given its own goal in applying for grant. So yeah, I would say that you know, obviously you just need to demonstrate that all of that stuff is in place, and it will add value to your organization. That, you know, you're a national organization, you have all of this kind of stuff. You might need to attach your constitution to the application. So you know, be clear about that in your application, and it'll add value to it, if anything. But I don't know if I'm answering the question. So yeah, it's because they don't want to be responsible for somebody losing their job if they pull the funding. That's somebody anonymous person said that, and I think that's a very good point, but it's a real shame. So just last question, and then we finish up. What if you underspent, but there was nothing in the application about sending the underspend back? Good point. I would kind of ask, you know, why were you underspending? Is there a way to use that grant effectively? Obviously in line with the application, but you know, sometimes if something came in way under budget, you might, you know, reach out to the funder and say, look, we actually managed to get this activity at a way reduced rate, and this is excellent. However, we think that this other activity could really add value to the project, and really justify that and demonstrate that, and just say, like, would you be okay if we use this remaining budget to add further impact to the project by you know, adding this additional activity, which we can then spend. You know, so I mean, that's obviously they don't have to say yes to that, but many of them will. You know, they'll have spent that money in their heads, and they'll be like, well, great, if you can achieve more impact for the same amount of cost to us, that's brilliant. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but I am at the end of my questions, and where am I time-wise? 20 extra minutes. So thank you to everybody who who stuck with us to this point, and I really hope that it was a helpful session, and do feel free to get in touch with us at the wheel. We actually have a new grants officer, Marie O'Connell. So Marie O'Connell at wheel.ie is one person you could get in touch with, but also just feel free to reach out to me directly, Emma at wheel.ie, and I can signpost your query internally here. Yeah, thanks so much for your time, and for sticking with me for this long. And that's it for me, Sinead. Do you have anything that you need to mention?
No, that's all. I've been taking notes of all those bits and pieces to add to that follow-up email. So we'll get to that next week. I think a few bits and resources to come up with. That was great. Thank you so much, Emma. And thank you everyone for sticking around. Have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.